to Emory Climate Talks. My name is Eri Saikawa, and I'm an associate professor of environmental sciences and the director of science policy and community engaged research at the Resilience and Sustainability Laboratory at Emory University. Emory Climate Talks is made possible by our anonymous donor that supports our trip to the United Nations climate negotiations. And Emory Climate Talks is in partnership with the Department of Environmental Sciences and the Resilience and Sustainability Laboratory at Emory University. Action to address climate change is being stalled in Congress, but now there seems to be a push to move forward just with the climate portion of the Build Back Better Act. We have been observing storms and wildfires being more frequent in the United States and in other places in the world. And it is encouraging to see majorities of registered voters supporting a variety of policies for climate change. And this is according to the Yale University study that came out last fall. I think it is a great time to think about climate justice aspect of what we are dealing with. Before we go into today's program, I wanted to talk about some logistics, and thank you all for listening. Please use the chat function to address any questions you may have to the speaker at any point during the talk. But we will have the time for Q&A at the end after the presentation, and I will encourage anybody who is interested in speaking up to raise their hands and unmute themselves when you are called. Most of the past talks are on our YouTube channel, and you can subscribe at youtube.com/c/Emory Climate Talks. Today's talk is also recorded and will be available online by next week or so. It is my real pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Professor Julie Sze, a professor of American Studies at the University of California, Davis. I have come across her work looking for materials on climate justice. So many students have asked about the materials on this topic, and I really loved the way Professor Sze linked Black Lives Matter, Dakota Access Pipeline, Flint incident, slow violence, sexual violence among the Indigenous women, and various other issues, including science, into a book titled Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. If you have not read it yet, I really encourage you to do so. Professor Sze has been working on environmental justice and inequalities, as well as the relationship between social movements and policy implementation. Her main areas of research are very interdisciplinary and lie at the intersection of environmental, urban, and ethnic studies of American studies. Professor Sze has two more books. One is titled Noxious New York, The Racial Politics of Urban Health and Environmental Justice, and the other is called Fantasy Islands, Chinese Dreams and Ecological Fears in an Age of Climate Crisis. I am so excited to have you, Professor Sze, and look forward to hearing about your work and your career path. And thank you for joining us. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I will try to share my screen right now. Okay, so do you all see this? Is that on here? I'm going to change it to the present function, but thank you for that introduction and the invitation, Professor Saikawa, and thank you, Leah, for all your help with this. I was explaining that my dog was neutered, so I am, if you hear a dog whimpering or something, that is what I'm doing right now. So I wanted to start with this talk called Climate Justice as Freedom, which is part of a project that I'm working on right now, a short book on critical climate justice. And I'll get to explain what that means in a second. So this talk overview is really thinking about this question of what climate justice means. This term has really suddenly hit everywhere. And like all big capacious terms, means different things to different people. So climate justice, like nature, like sustainability, is a term that is very, like, who's against nature? Who's against climate justice? Who's against sustainability? Obviously with big broad terms like this, there's a lot of contested politics about what this means. means. So what I'm going to talk about is what I mean by climate justice, by talking specifically about what I call a critical climate justice, which is an analytic that links political and cultural struggles for decarbonization, decarceration, demilitarization, and dominance within thinking about frameworks of decolonialism and abolition, to argue simply that climate justice and climate justice movements are freedom struggles. And I'll get through this. This will make more sense after the talk, but this is what I'm going to, basically try to argue. The argument is that as a freedom struggle, critical climate justice focuses on negative and positive freedoms. So freedoms from things like racial capitalism, colonial extraction, but also freedoms for things like love, regeneration, and living and practicing in community and solidarity. So what
Yes.
I'm going to, yes?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Professor Z. I think we are not seeing the slides properly. We're just at the first slide still, and
Okay.
it's not showing us the.
Okay, so sorry. Now I don't know where anything is. Now I see nothing. So can you see this?
Yeah, but it's still not a full screen though.
Yeah, I don't know what to do because I was sharing my screen, and so if it wasn't advancing, I don't know what to do then. So
yeah,
can I just keep it?
Then.
Can we just keep it on this? Because at least we'll see this slide. Okay.
Can you actually move the notes section to the bottom so that we can see a little bit bigger maybe?
Hold on.
If you go to the bottom where the notes are.
Yes.
Yeah, the
what
line.
do I do?
Line
move the line?
That. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. We were just talking about how technology is so stressful, and at this point I should know how to do this, but apparently, I'm on a different computer than I typically am because of the dog neutering. Okay, so what this talk is going to do is introduce these ideas and these documents and movement principles from frontline climate justice alliances, such as the Just Transition Framework from organizations like Movement Generation, and to introduce ideas of abolitionist climate justice. So what I want to talk about is critical climate justice, and critical climate justice as being a specific framework within climate justice movements that is grounded in frontline and fence line communities. And frontline and fence line is an activist generated term, which basically says the people who are most impacted and first in line of responsibility, but also least responsible, are the leaders of climate justice and climate justice movements. And what this means in practice is thinking about who is impacted by racism, classism, indigenous exploitation of land, exploitation of labor, questions of citizenship and gender. Again, to highlight this question of who is most impacted, and least responsible. And that is a term that the climate justice movement that I'm interested in, again, the critical climate justice, talks about in terms of frontline and fence line. First impacted, least responsible. And these fence line, frontline activists use transnational frameworks to distinguish its position against mainstream technologically driven conversations around climate policy, which focus primarily on technological and engineering fixes, and which assume, sort of hegemonic ideas of capitalism and market-based as being the ways to solve the climate crisis. And as such, critical climate justice as a movement and as a framework is a theory of enchantment that moves from hierarchical and global white supremacist visions of carbon, military, policings, and prisons, and human hierarchy over nature to bring us into an emancipatory future. So this is a book that I'm writing right now, a very short book, which is kind of exploring these ideas. And if for those of you who are environmental justice people or who study in this realm, this is obviously a take on David Pello's book on critical environmental justice, where he talks about sort of the contemporary wave of environmental justice being through these different moments. There's like the first wave of environmental justice, the second wave, and now we're kind of in the third, what he calls critical environmental justice. So I'm obviously like taking off from that idea. So today's questions, put simply, are what is critical climate justice and why does it matter? And what does freedom look like in the face of environmental and state violence and climate change in all of its different forms, military surveillance, policing cross borders, and so on. And I do this because for a few years I was giving lots of talks about climate injustice as racism, climate injustice as violence. And, there's a point at which, the movements are not just about critique, but also about imagining different futures. And so that's why I switched more to thinking about, what is the, more than just the negative critique of the problems, what are climate justice movements moving us towards? What's that vision? And so the outline for today is pretty simple. I'm going to talk a little bit about, again, environmental racism and climate injustice as violence, talk briefly about the book Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, the key questions and arguments. The work today really comes out of the third chapter of that book, and thinking about critical climate justice as freedom and giving you some concrete examples like the just transition framework, this idea of abolitionist climate justice, and then move to Q&A. So, again, this is not a finished text. These are ideas I'm working out, and that I really am excited to hear your thoughts and feedback. So climate injustice as violence. I think many of you already know this, so I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. There's so much work at this point thinking about these questions of disasters, impacts, and injustices. Many of you have seen these slides, and these are not, about carbon per se, but, this idea of the great acceleration, which is if you look at, different measures, basically 1950 is this moment where there's this takeoff of things. So of course, we can't think about, carbon and climate as separate from these broader systems of, the economy and extraction more broadly. These are, just old pictures of the World Meteorological Organization reports on, what climate risks, events, and impacts look like. You all know this over and over again, but of course, heat waves and wildfires, displacements because of changing, agricultural systems, ocean acidification, flooding, issues around hunger, displacement, disasters, and so on. Another visualization, and this comes from the British geographer, is looking at what impacts look like and different pathways, like what happens if we stay under 2 degrees, what happens if there's no action, and so on. So, I think people on this, call know this fairly well, either because you do the research or you read the news, et cetera, et cetera. None of this is surprising. Environmental justice has, and environmental justice movements and the scholarship has really focused on this, this position that climate change will expand and magnify inequality. So there are already existing social and environmental conditions that will just be made worse by climate change. This is another map of global injustices, mapping the impacts of climate change. Red is bad. This map looks at weather, sea level rise, agricultural productivity loss, and basically, you can see that this is a map where this is, a spatially distributed in a particular way. It's also, I think, it's important that we understand this as a political and a historical map. This is a map in many ways of colonialism and extraction. And again, that question of who is most responsible and who is most impacted, there is a misalignment between those things. In terms of environmental justice and climate justice movements, within the US, the movements have focused for at least since the mid-90s on this question of disproportionality, distributive impacts within the US and in the world, and focusing again on this question of unequal power at the core of the analysis, both of what is causing these problems, but also imagining solutions. And I always tell this story. I was a very young organizer right out of college, working in New York on an environmental justice alliance. And there was this coalition called the Environmental Justice and Climate Change Coalition. And, I'll tell you, I'm 48. So I hadn't grown up, knowing about climate change. I hadn't heard about it. And I remember thinking, that this organization had a fact sheet about what would happen if a hurricane hit New Orleans. And this was in 1996. And I remember reading it and thinking, oh, that can't happen. That's not the way it works. Like a whole city can't be flooded. And, and I think, in a lot of ways, Hurricane Katrina was kind of an opening salvo of the moment that we're in, which has intensified, these political and racial and class inequalities. And that kind of, I always talk about this story because, I'm sharing my sense of like innocence or naivete, like I didn't know, but everything they said is exactly what happened in the 96, flyer in 2005. And, one of the points that I always make in all of my classes and all the talks I have is that the climate scientists and the justice activists, and again, 96 and 97 is like the battle for Seattle, the movements against, free trade agreements, and so on. Everything that the activists and scientists say is right. That's what we can look at what's happened historically in the last 20, 30 years and say they were exactly right. And yet there is a persistent lack of inaction. Why? And that is a movement question, that's an ideological question, and so on. So the two images here are of Hurricane Katrina and, of course, the hyper policing of those left behind. And then an image from Kivalina, which is one of the 400 Arctic indigenous villages within the US in the state of Alaska that is facing imminent flooding right now and are pressing for relocation. Kivalina is not unique in the struggles that they face both in Alaska Native communities, which are of course connected to the impacts of Pacific Islanders, of those in the Caribbean, and so on. But Kivalina is important because they sued oil and gas companies for the harm that their products were doing to their community. The lawsuit was thrown out in the 9th District Court as being basically not a quote legal issue. And yet, I think that their struggle, their lawsuit is still really important in kind of pushing back against kind of the dominant ideas of thinking about climate change, harm, and so on. These are some images of climate justice movements within the US that I talked about in the book briefly, that Colleen Swan and Kivalina, an Inupiaq leader. The central image is of Kim Rivers Roberts and Scott Roberts from an incredible documentary, which I always try to encourage my students to watch, called Troubled the Waters. Which is one of my favorite documentaries around Katrina, and then a screenshot of the just transition principles, which I'll get to in a second. I'll get over, I think I'll skip that for now. Okay, so that was the first part. Just thinking about this question of environmental racism and climate injustice as violence. What does that mean? I think, at this point, it's fairly well understood by scholars and certainly by activists to be a form of violence. Now let me turn to the second part about environmental justice in a moment of danger. This is, Professor Saikawa introduced this book, which came out 2 years ago, right before COVID started. So the moment of danger got magnified, I think, by COVID. But this is a short, sort of teachable book that it tries to connect different movements and how they're connected to each other. I've been thinking about environmental justice and working on environmental justice at this point for 28 years since I was a student activist. And, I often try to tell my students like how I become like a historian of my own experience, trying to explain that GIS didn't exist. And when I started doing this work, I was seeing transparencies of lead exposure and racial demographics and, hospital admissions around asthma and just the complete, overlay of those literally on transparencies, and just having that moment of being not understanding because there wasn't this kind of flood of information that we have now because of the internet. For those many of us of a certain age didn't grow up with the internet. And so younger people can't imagine what does organizing look like, in the internet, without the internet? What is, the social movements now are much more available in terms of social media. People know about these issues. So we can't use the same tools that we, and it's a different struggle than we had in the 90s, which was trying to empirically prove that these things were real. That we're in a different knowledge situation. We're in a different technological age. And yet, we cannot be having the same conversations, of trying to empirically prove things. There's a lot of work that's already been done. And so, I wrote this book in part because I assume now that more people know about these movements, and that's a wonderful thing. And yet sometimes it can be kind of overwhelming to think about how they're connected to each other. Okay, so the key question in that book is what crossroads and moment are we in? And what might we learn from environmental justice movements in our moment of danger? The book argues that that violence in the U.S. In the U.S. and the world is both, burning, flooding, exploding in massive ways. And authoritarianism is linked with racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, gender violence, militarism, and corporate capitalism, and that these crises are interconnected. So questions of police and state-sanctioned violence, pandemic and public health, and climate disaster is more apparent around the world for those who protest against fascists and extreme economic and social inequalities made worse under COVID. And so this climate crisis has come home in the shape of hurricane, heat waves, and wildfires, and the old political order is crumbling. But what takes its place is under fierce struggle. So there's a lot of action on the streets, in classrooms, and in stories that are shaped within government chambers and corporate boardrooms. And so, when Trump came to California, after the wildfires, he said that, the problem with the wildfires was because Californians weren't raking leaves, despite the fact that 57% of forests in California are under federal control. And so, but I think despite, the fact that we're in a kind of media and ideological landscape where millions of Americans believe that facts don't matter, whether that's on COVID or climate, COVID and climate change will not go away because you wish it to be so. And it seems horrific and depressing to say this explicitly, but acting as if facts and science don't exist will only make problems worse. Denial is a prison, and we need freedom now. So we are dying, I think, simply in a warming world that colonialism created, that industrial modernity made worse, and which transnational corporations under neoliberalism is trying to finish off. But we also, of course, live in a rich and beautiful world made more precarious under threats, environmental and otherwise. And so this talk is really focused on, these questions of power, history, and knowledge, echoing and amplifying the questions and points that climate justice movements have made that foreground, again, this question of frontline and fence line perspectives. Climate justice movements, they reject, economic domination and how these and rather they imagine a world without inequality. Environmental justice activists from the early 90s till now rejected the idea of issues as being separate from each other, so that you could see air and water as separate from each other, from pesticides, toxicity, siting, and drought. And that you could separate environment, public health, and land use and economy as separate from the structure of economic and political life. So climate justice movements, I think, are really focused on this question of what I think links these case studies, and these are the case studies I talk briefly about in the book. What the book is structured around, very iconic, I think. A lot of people know what happened in Standing Rock. A lot of people know what happened in Flint. But then I also link it with less visible struggles. And so what I tried to do is talk about, so in some ways, the flip side of everybody knowing about these is that there's also a way in which they don't have the kind of same weight as they used to. I was talking in my class about Abu Ghraib, which only one of my students knew what Abu Ghraib was. And for those of you who don't know Abu Ghraib, please read about it. I think many of us learn about 9/11 in school, younger people, but you don't learn about Abu Ghraib. But we were saying it was a different kind of media landscape where when things happened, this is what happens when, in fact, there's too much information, not too much information, but like it can be hard to keep track and keep hold of it because there's so much going on. And so what I try to do in the book is to think about how these struggles are linked with each other, but also use the kind of keywords and analytic from ethnic studies, American studies, indigenous studies, and so on. So chapter 1 looks at settler colonialism, extraction, and gender violence, and really pivots around the indigenous environmental network. Chapter 2 talks about privatization and neoliberalism, and uses the Flint case study. But then I talk about the Central Valley, which is the region that I do a lot of work in as well. And the third chapter looks at Hurricane Katrina and Maria, climate justice and Kivalina, and thinks about, what does it mean to have a politics of non-naive radical hope in the moment where disasters seem everywhere and where affect, despair, and depression seems to be the dominant ways in which climate can be talked about. At the same time, there is a lot of rejection of kind of climate apocalypticism within climate justice movements that really focus on youth struggles and centralizing youth stories, hip hop, satire, etc. So environmental justice has been and is, and climate justice as well, synergistic movements and analytics that combine time, history, and a framework that understands that things that are bad make each other worse. So climate change, COVID, and sort of the broader politics of extractivism all align to make things worse. The book really just is a simple argument, which is that justice provides a soundtrack of freedom against violence and for freedom capaciously defined. And the argument is, again, that environmental justice is a freedom movement and climate justice is a freedom struggle that is particularly significant now. It's intersectional and it crosses time and space. So environmental justice and climate justice movement reject emotions of despair as they always have. Their modes, their affective modes, their emotional capacity is focused on resistance, survival, life affirmation against capital accumulation and economic growth, solidarities based on radical empathy, humor, grace, and transformation. Again, this politics that I call of non-naive radical hope. It's non-naive because it's grounded in lived experience in intergenerational trauma and violence. It is radical because the politics refuse reformist politics of making unjust systems more tolerable and more racially diverse. And these politics are based on hope, resistance, and solidarity between communities and ecosystems already made vulnerable to social injustice and environmental violence. And so in that sense, the book is really focused on this question. The book that I wrote before and the book that I'm writing now, which is basically the same thing I've been doing since I was 20, is thinking about environmental justice movements as sort of theory and praxis related movements that generate ideas that kind of have valence for broader context. So environmental justice is thinking about it as a freedom struggle means engaging with history, violence, imaginary and visionary perspectives. And it is, in Raymond Williams, the Marxist literary critic's words, a structure of feeling. So that's why I spent so much time in the book and, talking to students about these questions of political affect, emotion, and storytelling. And I'm very drawn, there's a new book that just came out by a political scientist named Libby Anker called Ugly Freedoms. And she talks about these appeals to freedoms in contemporary US political thought and how ideologies and practices of freedom legitimate other forms of oppression. And she writes, and this is a quote from Anker, stories about freedom, about people's connection to something called nature, and about political agency are important for climate politics. Any large-scale effort to halt global warming will depend upon reworking the stories underpinning destructive relationships to the planet and reworking these stories of freedom. In other words, how we tell stories of freedom matter. And this is, has been said by many others. Naomi Klein in A Planet to Win, Why We Need a New Green Deal, says the same thing when she says that the environmental movement and the mainstream climate movement has been imaginatively asphyxiated. So in contrast to this denuded generic climate justice term, frontline and fence line climate justice movements posit a different worldview and different stories of freedom that exist in current political and economic and cultural systems. Anker posits that, and frontline justice movements confirm that, again, this is Anker's quote, if the freedom to participate in and help compose a world alongside others is premised on a subject that is not a masculinized, heroic individual who self-wills his action, but rather a collaborative amalgamation of acts of non-human and human creatures that form an agentic ecosystem, then different stories of freedom will emerge from that vision. And others in like the book, I forget the name of the book, but talks about the idea of a radical, real, and effective Green New Deal, talks about what that looks like. A jobs guarantee, a homes guarantee, and dismantling fossil fuels and public utilities, this idea of public power. So these ideas of a real, radical, and effective Green New Deal offer utopian visions of freedom for climate justice, grounded in freedom from fear, freedom from toil, freedom to move, and freedom to live. And so environmental justice and climate justice matter. They have mattered always, but particularly now in the moment that we are in. And so let me switch, go quickly out of order. So, this is a slide that when I found this out, I said I would always talk about the slide forever, even if it doesn't make perfect connection, which is a slide of cumulative carbon emissions globally and historically. So the US is responsible for 25% of cumulative carbon emissions since 1750. And until 1882, the largest emitter was the United Kingdom because of empire, obviously. The US military now has 800 military bases around the world, which by itself as a nation would be the 58th highest carbon emitter. And so, and then of course, we can think about why there were oil wars in Iraq and so on, why we were in the Middle East. And so these questions of extractive resources for the US military, which has the single largest carbon footprint of any entity on Earth. And so, going back to what environmental justice movements do and what they offer, they have offered since 1991 the principles of environmental justice. There are 2002 reworking called the Principles of Working Together, which I think is a great document. And the one line I really think is important from there is, we need each other and we are stronger with each other. The Hermes Principles for Democratic Organizing, which talks about how movements have to be at the forefront, the Bali Principles of Climate Justice, and most recently in the last 2 years, the Indigenous Principles of Just Transition. And so, I think obviously we're not gonna have time to go over all of these, but I'm mentioning these if you're not familiar with these movement principles. So if we're interested in what critical climate justice looks like, movements have already said that. It's our responsibility to learn and to be connected to what they have said. The simple point is that, our struggles are linked, and that I think, the idea of closing borders is not, the answer. These politics right now, which I think are more visible around, self-care and mutual aid. I do want to spend a few minutes on, this question of, I'll just leave this on for a second. I want to think about critical climate justice and this term just transition. So just transition, like climate justice, is a term that is everywhere. And there's a really great article by Newell, I forget the other author, it said, a just transition isn't a non-carbon version of the world we live in now. That is not what a just transition calls for. And so environmental justice and climate justice movements theorize, and their theories and perspectives are well suited, not just for understanding our moment of danger, but in fighting it. So the interconnectedness of crises of climate change, toxicity, white supremacy, and the rise of authoritarian populism in the US and globally is ever clearer. And so scholars are linking COVID, climate, and violence in important ways. COVID and climate change are co-produced crises which necessitate intersectional analyses of understanding how overlapping and uneven conditions of great harm magnify each other. But where justice movements matter is that they reject this idea of never-ending death and destruction, whether it's climate or COVID. And so the dominant response is to normalize what scholars have and journalists have talked about, the shifting baselines of acceptable death rates in COVID or degrees warmed. But justice movements connect these seemingly acceptable majoritarian set of facts like COVID deaths or land loss due to rising sea levels and reject these as inevitable or acceptable. Climate justice movements envision and act upon their non-naive radical hope, build again on this foundation of art, love, creativity, restoration, political resistance, collaborative relationships, and humor and hip hop in the face of this calamitous global present that is built upon the funeral pyres of colonialism and corporate capitalism dependent on stolen land and labor. So this is a just transition framework from a collective called Movement Generation, which is based in the Bay Area, but which actually came to be after Hurricane Katrina. Again, because Hurricane Katrina was such a catastrophic event, but that magnified so many problems. And again, of course, in the context of the war in Iraq and the militarization of what happened to those left behind. And so Movement Generation has this just transition framework where they both do a critique and a move towards what the movement wants. And so if you see on the left, I don't know if you can see it super closely, the critique is of what they call an extractive economy. And so you could see the little image that says resources, extraction, dig, burn, and dump. So that's what a lot of climate, folks would understand. Like we want to keep oil in the ground, we're against oil extraction. But what they say the problem is much broader than just oil. They said it's a worldview around consumerism and colonial mindset. This question of work, governance and militarism, and enclosure of wealth and power. And what they want to do is to sort of move us to, we can't just critique, we also have to move to a vision of what we want. And so on the right, they have this idea of a living economy, this idea of a regenerative economy, cooperation, a different structure of work, different structure of the economy that's based on caring and sacredness, well-being, and deep democracy. So frontline climate justice activists foreground their perspectives, which again, position themselves as the leaders of policy practice and worldviews of this just transition world, which is not just a post-carbon world. The agenda of decarbonization, frontline climate justice activists argue, is not just about carbon, but a different vision of the world that is against oil, whiteness, and capitalism. And so they have, again, focused, and there's lots of even more all the time, organizations, networks, the Red Deal for Climate Justice from an Indigenous perspective, the Red, Black, and Green New Deal from the Movement for Black Lives, and in hundreds of local groups everywhere. Critical climate justice movements link political and cultural struggles for decarbonization, decarceration, demilitarization, and domination over nature within a framework of abolition and decolonialism. In other words, decarceration, a world without prisons and policing; demilitarization, a world without heavy war and violence; and a world without domination, where nature is abused and extracted through and beyond carbon, are interlocked problems. A just world for frontline climate justice activists is a remade world, one that takes decolonial, feminist, and abolitionist perspectives as their base for climate struggles and political transformations to overturn the legacies of colonialism, anti-Blackness, labor exploitation, and to continuing extraction and abuse of nature. Critical climate justice thus rejects hierarchical and global white supremacist visions of carbon, military, prisons, and policing, and human hierarchy and domination over nature. And to do so brings us into an emancipatory future as guests rather than hosts and dominators of the planet. Climate justice movements stand in living and continuing solidarity with freedom struggles in the contemporary moment and link those to in the past, those emergent from Black freedom, Indigenous, and anti-colonial and feminist social movements around the world. Going back to Anker, she says freedom entails both non-domination and domination, world making and world destruction, challenges to and impositions of unjust authority. So critical climate justice, I think, really, is talking about life upholding visions of freedom that draw upon the critique of negative freedoms, but also moves to different visions of what those positive freedoms look like. Against consumptive sovereignty, the freedom to not wear your mask, for example, and the freedom to conquer nature by consuming objects that one desires, to bend the world to one's will by devouring resources however they choose. Rather, critical climate justice are what she calls a part and parcel of a militant collective action invested in rehabilitating ecosystems and decarbonizing the economy, grounded in non-sovereign solidarity and radical mutuality between air, water, microbes, toxins, and other living beings. And so again, this question of negative freedom and positive freedom. And so, I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I just want to give you some examples of where I think critical climate justice is creating counter-hegemony and why counter-hegemony matters. Counter-hegemony is basically this idea, of course, from Gramsci, that we have to both critique institutions and the common sense, but it has to first grow in the mind as a possibility of alternative futures. And so the idea or the task of imaginative freedom is central. And why we have to really reject this idea of climate apocalypticism or climate nihilism, climate cynicism, this kind of course, where we have to live within capitalist domination, and growing resistance to the fidelity to authoritarian populism as politically inevitable. And what those things do together is to defang political opposition to dominant structures of power and its attendant institutions. Climate, so these are some images of what I talk about in chapter 3 of the book. I talk about this radical anti-capitalist film called Sorry to Bother You. Movement Generation has important cultural work. If any of you are students or young people or teach students, it's a great series of YouTube videos called The North Pole, which I've taught and which work pretty well. These are photos from Standing Rock. There's most recently, very interestingly, there was a climate justice comedy show that took place in Norfolk, Virginia, which is facing a lot of flooding in the African-American communities, and it's called Ain't Your Mama's Heat Wave. And so there's a lot of work that's going on among youth movements around comedy, hip hop, song, and so on. So critical climate justice movements, what they do is practice and imagine a counter-hegemonic radical climate justice politics, and then name their enemies quite explicitly: neoliberalism, corporate polluters, oil and gas companies, neglectful policy structures around immigration, asylum, and climate refugees, and global white supremacy. They rally against capitalists, privatization proponents, real estate developers, gentrifiers, and racist cops, including border patrol and detention. And they imagine the world that they want to make, one that is feminist, anti-racist, and indigenous-led, that lives with and not in hierarchical relation to nature, animals, and ecosystems. Only by identifying the roots and the relatedness between problems of fossil capitalism, war and militarization, policing and prisons, and hierarchy over nature can the collective we imagine a different post-carbon and just planetary future. Frontline environmental justice and climate justice groups have been fighting corporate power and state-sanctioned violence and white supremacy for a very long time. Whether you want to say 30 years from the formal naming of the environmental justice movement to 1492. So what they do, these climate justice, critical climate justice movements and structures are, they're endlessly creative in their analysis and their structure, that they imagine politics differently and they nurture and create convergences between the frontline worldview. And so what they do is try to imagine the future that they want to live in rather than waiting for it to be realized. And they bend towards radical directions, including abolition, anti-capitalism, decolonialism, demilitarization, and feminist perspectives. And so, I think that there's lots of examples within small island states, within climate justice movements that really focus on what this regenerative, restorative, and reparative climate and health justice future looks like. And so what I want to end here and then take a ton of questions. Environmental justice movements and climate justice movements make links within the US and across borders to create these cultures of solidarity. They do so when the groups at Standing Rock went to Flint, and so on. When groups focusing on small island states, also came and, make alliances with groups in the Alaska Natives. Environmental justice and climate justice movements travel between places, groups, and the past, present, and future, so across temporalities. And it is in these interconnections that justice movements are made and remade. This framework and praxis matters now more than ever as a principled base from which to bracingly face our collective planetary futures. Living in denial does not make the problem go away, whether that's climate change or COVID, notwithstanding the shifting baselines that normalize acceptable mass death. Though most people in the US would prefer to ignore our histories and our debts to each other, as well as our relations to the rest of the world, thanks to our enduring nationalist parochialism, the climate science is clear and justice movements are absolutely and resolutely right. I want to end with one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin, the author. People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns himself into a monster. Now is the moment of monsters, and those who seek to make their monstrosity seem logical, acceptable, and normal. Justice movements have always reminded us in their placards, music, and stories against this logical monstrosity. When in simple, like in the simplest slogans or posters, people and planet over profits. In 1938, Langston Hughes, the Harlem Renaissance poet, wrote a poem called Kids Who Die. And it opens with the following. This is for the kids who die, black and white. For the kids will die, certainly. The old and rich will live on a while, as always, eating blood and gold, letting kids die. Hughes, Baldwin, and climate activists everywhere remind us that old and rich will eat their blood, gold, and also their oil, while kids, usually black, brown, and indigenous, die. And this horror has to be recognized as a monstrosity. Environmental justice and critical climate justice is more than resistance to environmental racism and colonialism, as if that wasn't enough. Rather, they are a counter-hegemonic philosophy of practice a search for freedom beyond critique of state-centered policy incorporation or reformism. Rather, they challenge the status quo, and their vision is performative and cultural. And I don't have time here to talk about Benjamin Lay, but I wanted to I invite you all to read about Benjamin Lay, who was an 18th century Quaker abolitionist, and he, I think, has a lot of lessons for us now. And the abolitionist movement also has lessons for us now. Art making protest is life affirming in an extractive capitalist context that invites death of nature, peoples, and planets. And revolution means engaging with these politics of radical hope, justice, and solidarity. And so feelings for others can lead us against this death cult of whiteness, carbon addiction, and capitalism. This empathy has been in too far short a supply, embedded in the political and economic legacies that continue to structure our lives. Ongoing legacies of economic extraction that rendered organized violence and state and capitalist violence normal. Justice movements reject this common sense and such abstraction. Now we're in the moment of monsters and those who seek to make their monstrosity logical and normal. We, and I put us in here, environmental justice and critical climate justice reject the slow deaths and the fast violence everywhere. It's about living and loving beyond the shadows and the numbers, and about love and creation in a moment, in a political moment that fetishizes death and spurns care. We're in a moment where environmental justice movements are about reclaiming the ethics of morality and widening the circles to respect land and home and to acknowledge trauma and history. Our urgency now is to maximize our collective convergences towards this ethic of care in the spirit of political solidarities and to bend the arc of justice and freedom from oil and all forms of extraction, hierarchy, and violence. The time is now, because when else is it? So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Professor Z. This was so enriching, and I am just stunned about what you covered in 45 minutes. Thank you so much, and sorry for the technical issues as well at the beginning, but it worked out perfectly. And thank you to everybody as well for providing resources, and I'm extremely grateful that there has been a lot of chat going on, and I'm sure that there are a lot of questions. So I'm going already to the first question that is being asked from Joel. He's asking, how can we stay connected to the work you're doing?
I mean, my work is all I do. I'm sort of a translator to the work that is being done on the ground. So what's much more important is how to connect with climate justice movements. And so I don't know, what's your local context. I have some colleagues in Atlanta. I don't know, there's so much important work that's being done on the ground locally. And so that some of the groups I talk about, like the Climate Justice Alliance, are very visible, online. So I think the more important work is not how to connect with me, but what the movements are doing and how to affiliate with their work and to support their work. So, but thank you for that question. I'm always available. I'm online. I have office hours. Anybody can email me anytime for anything.
That's such a nice invitation. And I think we will all be looking for your new book to come out. So we hope to know when that's going to be as well. So the next question is from Catherine. She asks, you mentioned disproportional impact. So do you think that the current state of the pandemic and how some communities have been hurt worse will exacerbate environmental injustices?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this, a lot, because, this question of environmental inequalities and racial disproportionality is something that, as I told you, I started doing this work, in 1993 as a student, and there was a lot of question of whether there was inequality, environmental inequality, and the environmental justice movement really focused on environment and health. 30 years ago. And basically, at this point, there's so much empirical research about, that there are disproportionate environmental inequalities, and that health inequalities are also very real, and that there's no separation really between health and environmental. And so, on the question of COVID, there was a lot of work about how, the exposure to worse air quality in, African-American, urban, and other racially people of color, made basically COVID worse. So I think that, there's a question again of like, why is that? I think people understand that that's real. But then the question always that comes back is like, why is that not acted upon, and so on. So, I've been very obsessed with disproportionality for, a long time. And, the US is, of course, 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's, prisons. In the early parts of the pandemic, it was 25% of the world's COVID deaths. I haven't looked at the numbers recently and stuff. And so, I think that the problem, politically, and here I'm not talking about things that I actually researched. This is just my opinion right now. Do you know what I mean? But that, there is such a focus on this kind of autonomous self. And that's why I think Anker's book is so interesting, as opposed to sort of a collective, politics of care, and we can see this, perfectly in the last presidential administration. Like Trump really embodied that, the fidelity to ignorance, the fidelity that your own, like I could kill anyone and nothing would happen. Do you know what I mean? Your own lack of knowledge, your own, like drinking bleach will kill COVID. Do you know what I mean? And so you can see, the inaction on COVID and the inaction on climate change, they make perfect sense, ideologically, because they really require, a very different kind of politics around, mutuality and a connection that is very not dominant in the US political context. And of course, it's not unique to the US. It's very similar to what happened in Brazil. Of course, what's happening in Brazil is also tied to, the climate crisis and so on. So, that kind of question of like, what is freedom to develop, freedom to like basically have complete autonomy, freedom for, to maximize your profits, like don't tread on me, all that kind of stuff. You know what I mean? So I forget what the initial question is. I just started going, going on a random, link. And it's very hard for me to respond to the questions because it's like reading them and responding is difficult. So maybe Professor Saikawa, can you pick one or two? And then when you ask them to me, then I can like process it rather than like read and process.
Sure. I'm happy to do that. So we'll go to the next question. So Julia is asking, what are the steps we can take in our daily life to help heal climate injustice?
That's a great question. That is a great question. I think, we're the amazing part about the moment we're in is that more people care about this question from very different perspectives. So for example, a lot more awareness of things like fast fashion, and the limits of kind of mindless consumerism, which doesn't mean that, your individual choice will make that big of a difference, but of course it does. So thinking about that question asks us to think about who we are as individuals. And of course, individuals do matter, in terms of changing the idea of the common sense. So I think, everybody has to answer that question for themselves, but at the same time, there is a broader shift to understanding that these are not just individualized, choices. On the other hand, saying, I'm not going to buy anything from Amazon, do you know what I mean? Like would I think be a decent, start. Like, why do I buy all my books from Amazon? Because it's the cheapest. Well, why is it cheapest? Because they have, garnered power. And, I think dominance. So, and so that's, for me right now, it's like, okay, I'm not going to buy anything. Do you know what I mean? From Amazon. I can not buy anything, do I really need this? And, I think the emphasis on consumerism, is obviously very limited. On the other hand, thinking about how our individual lives and what we wear and what we eat and how it's made, those are more people understand that than ever before, which I think is a great thing. I mean, for those of us, there are some older people in this room, the stuff that we're talking about used to be so marginal. You know what I mean? Like so marginal. People really didn't think like a lot of people. Now people understand a lot of the issues. So if we don't have to do as much education, it's more about the practice. And I'm really against like single approaches to things. I think that, I do believe that it has to make sense within, the local context, within individual people and communities, what you can do and so on. There's a lot more awareness of the dangers of, plastics and, all that kind of stuff. So, on a micro level, that's just one.
Yeah, I think that's really true what you say. And then there are so many students that are so excited about, listening and learning from you. They are so aware of the issue, and then they really want something done at the university level and then at the local level. And so this is so nice to be able to have this discussion as well. So Robert is now asking specifically about your slide 3. You mentioned radical theory of enchantment. He asks, can you talk more about what you mean by enchantment?
I saw that question and I was hoping that you wouldn't ask, of this, because as I told you, I'm still working on this book right now, but that is an idea that, of course, not of course, if you read Silvia Federici, who's a feminist, and she wrote this book on witches and Caliban, a very important book. And so let me see. No, I cannot say more because apparently I have not thought about this in a very long time. On a very interpersonal level, I did the whole COVID everything, COVID divorce, COVID puppy, and so on. So at some point I was thinking about enchantment. And I know that it's from Silvia Federici, and it has a lot to do with the sort of modernity and gender. But what I meant, I'm not sure, but thank you for reminding me. I should either get back to that idea or take it out of my slide. So
I'm so sorry to ask you that.
No, it's okay. I would say read Silvia Federici if you haven't. And this is also one of those moments where scholars and activists like Silvia Federici, Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore are having a broader impact and understanding of their work. And, Angela Davis and Sylvia and Ruth Wilson Gilmore have been working on abolition and prison abolition and Black freedom struggles for, since the 60s, critical resistance from the 90s. And now, being profiled in the New York Times. So actually there's a New York Times article about Silvia Federici, which is a great overview article if you're not really going to read her book on, witches and the Caliban. So I think that book, for me, as soon as I get off, that's probably the first thing I'm going to do is reacquaint myself with it. I have really, oh shoot. I see my dog doing something bad right now. So I'm going to ignore that right now. Speaking of non-human nature, but yeah, my book is a little bit, behind. And so, but thank you. That was a fair game question. I would say it has something to do with modernity and gender, but I cannot remember anything more than that.
Well, that was great. But is your dog okay? Do you need to take a break a little bit?
He is fine. Whether the thing he's playing with will be fine, and the vomit that he's laying in, this will all be things that I will deal with in a few minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next question from Narika is, do you ever talk to your students about dealing with climate anxiety? Has your research delved into how we can alter our urban planning to help with the shift away from the hierarchy of humans over the environment, like more green spaces, walkable cities, etc.?
Okay, you have to give me 1 second because I don't want him to eat this.
Yes. Okay, so while we are taking a little bit of a break, I just wanted to let you know that you are more than welcome to raise your hands and ask questions by yourselves as well, so that it doesn't always just come from me. So feel free to raise your hand if you would rather want to ask your questions directly. I'm happy to read the questions if they come in the chat, but wanted to let you know.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. Yeah, I think the other book that I really love is by Sarah Jaquette Ray, and it's called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And she actually writes, she's an environmental studies professor at Humboldt State, and she talks about, the inability of her students to imagine a future, like literally cannot imagine a future. And so, I think there's a lot of, this question of who has climate anxiety and what are its political or affective dimensions is really important. And that's why I spend so much time focusing on climate justice and environmental justice movements, not because they win. Actually, most of the time they lose. But that's not actually always the point. Of course, there's the broader issue of like what's a winner and what's a loss. But environmental justice movements have lost more campaigns than they have won, to generalize. But it's not the winning that matters. It's the constant struggle and the refusal to sort of like just die. I think, it's the continued struggle that is the lesson that we all need to learn now. And I think, for me, in California, when the wildfires came, affectively and, practically, because my son has asthma, it was such a hard moment. And, it was right around, with all the protests around, George Floyd and police violence. And, you couldn't go out because of the wildfires and you couldn't be, but you needed to be out. And sort of that feeling of like being trapped by systems that are out of your control. And, seeing kind of the overt state violence that was happening against protesters, there was just this like assault, and the kind of feeling of powerlessness or lack of agency. And I think, in a lot of ways, what environmental justice and racial justice and justice movements remind us is that there are always people that have been vulnerable to violence, where that feeling of feeling trapped and, there's no future, there's this, everything is conspiring and systemically. And yet the most vulnerable are always fighting. And that's the biggest struggle. I think that, that's the argument that I make in the book. It's the fight that matters, actually. And so climate justice and environmental justice activists are not nihilistic. They're funny. They dance and they make art and music and eat and have animals and old people. And there's just a sense of community and connection that is really, it is life affirming and, beautiful. And so I think that's what, we have to reject climate nihilism, because there are lots of communities that were, supposed to die because their utility or their continued survival was not, sanctioned by society. Native people, descendants of enslaved folks, and so on. And yet the survival is the resistance. And that's what matters right now in this moment. You can't just like crawl into a bubble, despair, and like just endlessly watch YouTube. I mean, I'll be honest, I do that sometimes. You know what I mean? But you cannot do that. And so, anyone who's involved with movements knows that, that it's like part of it is about like just you draw energy for the long haul. You can't just like burn out and just like say, okay, well, this was a phase. And then I just, now I'm just going to go back and make a ton of money and live my life. You know what I mean? There are folks who have been like, no, that system is not for me. It wasn't made by me. It wasn't made with me in mind. And the system doesn't work. It's broken and it needs to be changed. And that is actually, I think, the most important analysis from environmental justice and climate justice. And that's a rejection of nihilism. Always.
Yeah, you're such a scholar activist. And there is actually a question from Henry. He asks, do you think any congressional action can assist in environmental and climate justice?
Yes, I have, there are certain people who I follow their work. I'm actually not on Twitter and I don't like follow a lot of that stuff, but I think, sorry. My dog does not like the mail being delivered. So I'm sorry about that. So what I was going to say is, for those of you who are active on Twitter, I think Daniel Aldana Cohen is an important climate sociologist, climate activist whose work I deeply respect. And so, I basically, whatever, Daniel says, I think he and a few of his colleagues a couple of years ago wrote a book, and I forgot what it's called. And that was the quote from the Radical Real Green New Deal was their chapter from that book. If someone can find the book, that would be great. But I think that of course, congressional action matters. And I'm not, I don't follow legislation and policy like on that level, but I know Daniel does. And so I would, point others to them. I'm a movement person mostly, and I'm interested in the movements themselves are of course on the ground and deeply involved, with the Biden administration and deeply involved at state level policy making. That's definitely true in California and so on. So I'm not, there has to be a focus on what this means in a policy realm, in a practical realm, but that's not actually what I focus on. So I would direct you all to, what it looks like within your state, within, your context, to see how, the movements are translating this to, what this looks like in actual legislation. That chapter, there's some great reports about like a people's Green New Deal, what a regenerative economy looks like, where they talk about, expanding solar in public housing. There's all this activism in New York around public power and so on. So, I hopefully that's enough to like start, these are always just beginning conversations. So thank you. Oh, thanks.
Great. So Jared is asking, is there any way to weave greener and more equitable infrastructure into our current cities? Or are they built in a way that makes this impossible and perpetuates environmental inequality?
Nothing is impossible because it was made to be that way. So if it was made to be that way, it can be unmade to be that way. My colleague Steve Wheeler has a new book that's really, he's an urban planner and really focuses on the built environment and landscape. And so for those of you who are interested in landscape and urban planning, his book is just coming out, UC Press. And so, I mean, there's a lot of people in the room, so I don't really know, who's like where people are coming from kind of intellectually. But, I think that question of is it impossible? I never use the word impossible. Neither do climate justice and environmental justice people. Nothing is inevitable. It's always, this is why, I didn't really get into this super a lot, but, this is why hegemony and counter hegemony matter, which is, the counter hegemony, it pushes back about hegemony is basically like the common sense, like this is the world we're in. So therefore we have to exist within these parameters. Well, the world we're in is a product of history, and it's a product of institutions that were built, but they are also being unbuilt and remade all the time. And this is why the culture and the common sense and sort of the rise of memes and, the critique going on in social media, this is why I spent a little bit of time talking about sort of culture and cultural production. And that's why Movement Generation has this whole thing about, that this is also a cultural front, and that's obviously a reference to like the Popular Front. And Michael Denning's book about like sort of radical working class solidarity in the 1930s, he wrote a book called The Popular Front. So, climate justice is also a cultural front that's being fought around. And so, I think there's a lot of pragmatic things that can happen, and they are happening, at least, in California, like infill development, there's a lot of the regional planning organizations. There's a lot of subsidies for, solar in public housing in California, so there's a lot of practical policy shifts that are happening. But again, I think the question always is like, well, how do I translate this in the realm that I work in? what can I do in the world that I'm in? So if you're in urban planning, that's different from being in education. And that's different from being in a nonprofit. And that's different from being, a legislator, but again, there isn't one way or one thing. It's just it's such a huge issue. So we need everybody to do everything all the time. It's just like a nonstop front, in all ways, big and small. I see a hand on the upper. I don't know who you are.
Yes,
Hi.
I'm so excited. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Clara. How are you? I haven't seen you in a long time.
Hey.
I know Clara separately.
I was going to say
you.
the same thing. It was great to see you.
Yeah, you got a haircut.
I did. I chopped it all off.
I didn't recognize you.
Thanks so much for your talk. Yeah, it's really great to hear what you're working on and the book that you're bringing together. I kind of had a question around just like, I remember first being introduced to climate justice like years ago and thinking like, wow, this is such an amazing thing that brings together so many freedom movements that I'm excited about and really kind of coheres them together in a way that makes sense and gets us to like the beyond, the after. And so I was wondering, like, what do you think about how climate justice can bring together like these kind of foundational things that we need to reckon with, like the roots of the US and the settler colonialism, or thinking about whiteness as like, the way that white communities are invested in structurally advantaged, or thinking about capitalism and its origins and colonialism. I think it brings together a lot of foundational stories and narratives about where we come from and why we're here. And I think too, especially like being in this realm, being in academic spaces, like getting sociologists to look over the hall and think about like non-human people, non-human like beings, or environmental scientists to look across the other way and think about like social systems and structures of power. So I think there's a lot of way that it brings together, many amazing freedom projects. So I was wondering like, what is kind of the possibility to get us to reckon with not just like the political tinkering per se or the market tinkering, but really thinking about like these foundational questions of like how we came to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I think climate justice can do that. But I also think climate justice, and that's why I spend so much time talking about what I meant by climate justice. You know what I mean? And why I talk about critical climate justice as distinct from a climate justice that a big green will say that they do climate justice, but it really is just like, carbon credits or whatever, you know what I mean? And so I think that, it can be this amazing connective analytic. And, I think that I'm always against the idea that like one thing is like the main leader or main agent, and I think climate justice is part and parcel of justice movements more broadly. Do you know what I mean? So like, I'm not interested in saying, well, climate justice is the macro frame that's going to encompass all those things. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that that's, I don't know what that does. Do you know what I mean? On the other hand, I think that, the way that the frontline and fence line climate justice movements are saying this and doing the work is incredible. Like your mind starts to like, go a little bit like it's overwhelming. You know what I mean? And I was thinking about some work that I just am finishing with a colleague who's a Micronesian activist, health activist, and scholar, and just thinking about Marshallese. And so like the Marshallese are particularly vulnerable to climate change, right? Because of their islands and small in the Pacific, a small island state. And so because of that, and because of, the US bombing of their land, and, they're highly exposed to nuclearism, they are able to come to the US and then have the like highest COVID rates, because of their exposure in the occupational, sites that they work in, but also because they live in, very communally and in housing and so on. For me to think about, okay, well, what does climate justice mean for the Marshallese and the right now? What does justice look like for the Marshallese? Not just on climate, but on COVID, and about anti-nuclearism. And so, if you start thinking about like, what does, how are these legacies linked? But then also, you know, what does it get to you? Like your mind starts like, it starts to hurt. Do you know what I mean? Like it's overwhelming. And, you know, working with the woman around this issue is like, there's so much pain. There's so much pain and death. Do you know what I mean? Even before COVID, you know, around nuclearism and so on. And so I think, you know, this, your brain hurts, but then it's also because it hurts. You know, those histories are violent. They're horrible. And so, you know, I think in some ways, like we're still kind of in like reckoning, like we're still in a reckoning mode. Do you know what I mean? Before we can even get to like repair, or, you know, Olufemi Taiwo and his scholar, he's been thinking about climate reparations. You know, what does climate reparations look like? Well, what does reparations look like? You know, not even just climate. Do you know what I mean? And so, you know, I think these are the terrain that we are all going to be talking about with climate. You know, climate reparations, restorative and regenerative, not just as keywords, but like, what does this really look like? You know, like what does regenerative or restorative economy or ecology look like in the Marshall Islands? You know, it's been so heavily bombed. Do you know what I mean? But that, so it's not just the Marshall Islands, it's in the bodies of folks who are, you know, living in Oregon, who are disproportionately impacted by COVID, you know. And yet where I still have the hope and the non-naive radical hope is the Marshallese youth are super active on climate justice. Do you know what I mean? They're still claiming and saying, you know, that they exist. They still exist as a people and as a culture and as a resistance movement. And actually they generate, there seems to be a generative political identity that's based on that vulnerability. And so I think that's where climate justice movements are really, really powerful, because they give us, not like in a like we can all follow them kind of way, which I think is some of what I was trying to get at, but that like that is, we don't know. Do you know what I mean? What that looks like. We don't know what regenerative, you know, systems look like in the Marshall Islands. And yet survival and the continued existence of Marshallese teenage youth, you know, leading in the front line around climate justice is a powerful thing. Do you know what I mean? And so for me, the hearing their struggles, their stories, their analytic, but also, you know, their words and their poems and their beauty and their dance is like, that's how I don't get into a nihilistic, like laying on my dog's bed crying about the future. Do you know what I mean? And stuff, you know, I have to feel like, you know, my time on this earth and my energy is focused on supporting and being in alliance with folks who are forever fighting. I don't even remember what your question was, Clara, but we should talk separately. You know, but thank you for asking it.
Yeah, so there are still 2 more questions left. So we would like to go over that if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Michelle is asking, you raised the point about the disconnect between the information being put forth by scientists or activists and meaningful action. What are your thoughts on ways that we can bridge this information gap and drive systemic change?
Yeah, well, I mean, you all are in Georgia. So this goes back a lot to elections, and we know, you know, how the vote around voting rights happened, you know, and environmental justice and social movements are, you know, both like connected to electoral politics, and they're also transcendent of electoral politics. So, I mean, I think what we can do is it's about politics, you know, both like formal politics, but politics, like everyday lived politics. And so, you know, always push back, you know, against this pushback, because the reality is the exact existing systems that exist benefit interests. They benefit corporations that, you know, are structured in a certain way. They are benefiting the people who are invested in the stock market. They're benefiting individuals. And that, you know, of course, we all live within those contradictions too, you know, so I'm not saying that we have to live like a life of complete, you know, purity or, you know, like have to live in, completely, coherent, like political ways. But I think, we have to also, be always pushing for, some of the pragmatic things. I think there was a question about what are the groups in Atlanta that I work with. And I've known, folks like Felicia Davis and Nataki Osborne Jelks for a while, for 20 plus years. And so these environmental justice leaders were also the main leaders to get the Black vote out in Georgia, and to make sure what happened, that there wasn't a suppression of voter rights. So this is, both bigger than electoral politics, but it also is electoral, So, I mean, I think that's one thing, because as we know, every vote matters, both in elections, but also, in the votes themselves around, legislation and so on. So, it's pressure, pressure, pressure all the time. And Felicia, has been working on these issues, going back, and the legacies around, the civil rights movements, we're talking, like decades. And so, that's how we support, we live in, we do our own work, and we connect with others. And then we show up, and we do what's right, if we're guided by our principles. And so for me, that's why I spent a lot of time talking about the movement principles, because whenever I'm not sure about something, I always go back to them. How does this align with the Hermes principles for democratic organizing? How does this project I'm working on, even if it's a little project with a student, am I building power, for a community? Is the student actually taking the lead? How does this build, and not just for my own ego or whatever? Do you know what I mean? And so that's why the principles are useful, and the movements are already doing the work. We just have to show up and support, and continue to do our thing, but also change in the things that we're doing. I see this also in sustainability curriculum. Like I said, I've been doing this work since I was like 20, and now there's suddenly an institutional understanding that sustainability curriculum should think about environmental justice. It sounds kind of obvious now, but like 5 years ago, that wasn't obvious. That you could talk about sustainability. You could talk about sustainability or environment and never talk about environmental justice, never talk about race, never talk about social inequality. And I know this because this is what happened at UC Davis, where I teach. It was very, very much a marginal thing. And yet the students got organized, and have been pressing for more hires that work in this area, more acknowledgement of this research. It's also completely unethical, I think, because it's a real thing. Environmental justice and climate justice movements are active, at least in California, and in passing policy and in shaping, programs and policy making. So it's also just curricularly, it's irresponsible to not center this as well. So I think we do what we do, but also have a broad view of what that means. We cannot use the same analytic, the same readings and frameworks that we were trained in as graduate students. Do you know what I mean? And then just expect, the world has changed around us, in ways that the environmental justice and climate scientists knew, was going to happen if it wasn't interrupted. So what we have to do is do what, folks in the 60s did, and throw our bodies, in the gears. Sometimes more literally direct action, but sometimes more in the work, I want to do this work, and what does it mean for my institution to take it seriously?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Last but not least, I want to let Bob ask the question himself.
Hi, thanks. And thank you, Julie, for your excellent presentation and depth of understanding. And I'd kind of like to bounce off the idea. I'm involved with carbon pricing legislation, and have noticed that Dr. Bullard, considered by many the father of environmental justice, has supported carbon pricing. How open do you think other environmental justice movements within the US might be to accepting a carbon pricing approach that uses the revenue to support environmental justice groups, low-income communities, and job retraining for coal miners or fossil fuel workers?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, I mean, it's very hard to generalize within environmental justice, movements and leaders and thinkers. So I think that within California, there's a lot of questions of what the oil transition looks like for workers and what does it look like in the Central Valley and so on. And so I think, like with many movements, there is a lot of diversity. There's diversity of thought, there's diversity over tactics, there's diversity over leadership and so on. And so, my own affiliation, my own tendency tends to be really focused on the sort of not like individual leaders, like father environmental justice kind of approach. He's, I've known Bob again since, the early 90s. But, it's not really about, in the movement generation, they have this idea of like, there are the marble, the bag of marbles, do you know what I mean? Approach, which is every group is like adding something and it's the something together that gives it its power. Do you know what I mean? And so, it's the many, the frontline communities are doing their work from a local way, but they're also connected through alliances. And I think that alliance structure is something I kind of alluded to, I didn't really talk about. And it's a very different politics from when I started doing this work, which was much more like, there was a lot of fights around who was going to be leaders and who was had access to funding. And, those are still very real questions. But I think the collective, many, connected but collective is really much more powerful.
So you get the sense that there's a kind of a coming together in a broad community, not just with environmental justice, and situations, but also with those who are starting to realize we've got to do something at least to get the fossil fuels.
Yes, I think that's what it looks like. And I think there's a lot more research on that topic. But, as I said to folks, everybody's welcome to email me or, talk or want to, talk more and stuff. So anyway, I don't have a lot more, to say. I think, basically there's not a single environmental justice movement, obviously, and a single, set of organizations or, it's many. And I think the beauty is that there's more and more folks understanding that these are, central, like one of the fundamental issues that we have to deal with for all kinds of reasons. And, I think that for me, it's like, that's amazing. Like, and so when I've talked about, my example of like, I didn't know about climate change. I didn't grow up hearing about it. And I didn't grow up hearing about it because it was suppressed by oil and gas companies. In the same way that knowledge about, cigarettes causing lung cancer was suppressed by tobacco companies. Do you know what I mean? And so again, that question of, why we know, what we know, and why is there not action? Those are the most important ones. And I think we have to be, and, I didn't show that there's this great Boots Riley clip that Movement Generation puts out called Brother Earth, I think it's called. But they are really explicit about naming the enemies, including like corporate logos and so on. So,
Well,
yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate your comprehensive viewpoints of all of these efforts. And within the Citizens Climate Lobby, we're also trying to incorporate and understand the situations, to listen, establish relationship, and broaden the base of support. We see ourselves as bipartisan as well.
Yeah. And so I think, the mainstream environmental movement was, which environmental justice movements, in the 90s were very much resistant to kind of mainstream environmental movements were majority white, they were middle class, there was very much not a recognition that these perspectives matter. I don't think that's true anymore. Do you know what I mean? And so that's why I also have my own levels of some optimism. Do you know what I mean? And so the kind of what you're describing makes sense to me. Like it makes sense to me, but also it wasn't true like 20 years ago. Do you know what I mean? And so we also do have to acknowledge when things are better and when things do change too. So, and I think that I really am glad to hear, that what you're talking about, because a lot of the Hermes principles talks about, sort of humility and sort of like talking to folks and building relationships and, sort of extraction as being more than just extraction in the ground, like extractive relationships are part of extraction too, And so I think that there's more of, there are shifts, and those are to be also welcomed, but also, continually renourished as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's almost 1:30 now. And thank you so much for the great discussion, the great presentation, Professor Z. We will be back on February 18th with the president of Sierra Club Board of Directors, Mr. Ramon Cruz. So I hope many of you will be able to come to that. Have a safe and healthy weekend. And thank you so much again for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.